What if the Titanic never sank? On the night of April 14th, 1912, the greatest ship ever built struck an iceberg. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing North Atlantic. The sinking of the Titanic became the most famous disaster in modern history, a story of hubris, class division, and catastrophic failure. But what if the lookout had spotted the iceberg just 30 seconds sooner? What if the Titanic had arrived in New York on schedule, greeted by cheering crowds? The world we live in would be unrecognizable, and not in the ways you might expect. Let's set the stage. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. She was a floating palace, 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, first-class cabins that cost the modern equivalent of $100,000 for a single voyage, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium, a squash court, a swimming pool. Her designers called her practically unsinkable, though the word unsinkable was never used as confidently as legend claims. She represented the pinnacle of the Edwardian Age, a gilded era that many believed would last forever. When she left Southampton on April 10, 1912, she carried over 2,200 souls, and one very specific future for humanity. Here's where history could have changed. Lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m. The Titanic was traveling at 22 knots. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard to starboard. They had 37 seconds. It wasn't enough. But imagine the lookout had binoculars which were locked in a cabin because the key had been forgotten in Southampton. Imagine the warning came at 11:39 p.m. instead of 11:40. Just 60 additional seconds. Maybe the ship misses the iceberg entirely. Maybe she just grazes it. The Titanic arrives in New York on April 17, 1912, right on schedule. And the 20th century takes a completely different path. John Jacob Astor IV was on board. Worth $87 million in 1912, that's over $2.5 billion today. He was one of the richest men in the world, an inventor, a novelist, and a real estate magnate whose family built the Waldorf Astoria and much of Manhattan. He died in the sinking, at age 47. In our timeline, he never saw his son Vincent grow up. But in this alternate timeline, Astor returns home, continues to dominate American real estate, and invests in emerging industries. His support of early radio and aviation could accelerate both industries by a decade. The Astor family may even rival the Rockefellers in shaping the American century. Here's where it gets dark. The Titanic disaster caused sweeping maritime reforms, lifeboats for every passenger, mandatory 24-hour radio watch, the International Ice Patrol that still tracks icebergs today. Without the sinking, none of these changes happen, at least not in 1912. Ocean liners continue to carry far too few lifeboats. Radio operators still go to sleep at night. And then, inevitably, another disaster happens. Maybe in 1920. Maybe 1925. But when it does, the death toll could be even worse. The Titanic's tragedy saved countless lives in our timeline by forcing a safety revolution. Without it, that lesson comes later and at higher cost. The Titanic sinking is often called the symbolic end of the Edwardian Age, that last gilded era before World War I shattered the old world. Her death became a metaphor for the unsinkable confidence of Western civilization meeting the iceberg of modernity. Without that shock, does the cultural mood of 1914 shift? Does the optimism of the early 20th century last just a bit longer? Some historians believe it might. The cultural pessimism that followed the sinking, the sense that even the greatest human achievements could fail catastrophically, never takes root. And that changes art. That changes literature. That might even change how nations respond to the crisis that's coming. Here's a strange consequence. The Titanic disaster accelerated the development of ship-to-shore wireless communication because it demonstrated how badly it was needed. Without that urgency, radio technology develops maybe 5 years slower. When World War I breaks out in 1914, the British Royal Navy has less sophisticated wireless gear. German U-boats have a slightly easier time. The Battle of the Atlantic could go differently. American entry into the war, which depended partly on sinkings like the Lusitania, might be delayed or avoided. The war ends differently or lasts longer. Europe bleeds more. Consider this. The Titanic in our world is legend. Books, documentaries, the 1997 film that earned $2 billion and became the second highest-grossing movie of all time. James Cameron, Leonardo DiCaprio, Celine Dion singing about hearts going on. None of this exists in a world where the Titanic simply arrived on time. She becomes just another ocean liner, perhaps remembered for her grandeur but not for tragedy. The billions of dollars in tourism from the wreck site, the ongoing fascination, an entire cultural industry, it never forms. A strange kind of absence that shapes popular culture in ways we'll never fully map. But the iceberg fields didn't disappear just because one ship got lucky. In this alternate timeline, another disaster happens. Maybe it's the Mauretania. Maybe it's the Lusitania, which in our history was sunk by a German torpedo in 1915. Without the Titanic lessons, when disaster strikes, it's worse. More deaths, more panic, more chaos. Safety reforms finally come, but at a heavier price. History seems to demand its lesson about ocean travel. It only differs on which ship writes that lesson in blood. The transatlantic passenger trade was the largest industry of its kind in the world. The White Star Line, which owned Titanic, might have avoided bankruptcy. The company survived the sinking but was weakened. Without that trauma, they might have dominated Atlantic shipping through the 1920s and 30s, competing hard with Cunard. Ship designs evolve differently. Perhaps Atlantic crossings get even more luxurious before being replaced by aviation. The jet age might come a few years later, because ocean liners remained profitable longer. And an entire generation of Americans might see Europe not from a plane window, but from a deck chair at sunset. Here's the most haunting part. Over 1,500 people died that night. Each of them had families, had futures, had children who would have had children who would have had children. In our world, those lineages simply ended. In this alternate timeline, they continue. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly couple who refused to be separated and died together, watch their great-grandchildren grow up. Band leader Wallace Hartley returns to England and marries. The Guggenheim family doesn't lose Benjamin. Millions of people alive today who aren't, and millions of others who are, trade places across the quantum line of one lucky midnight turn. The Titanic mattered to us precisely because she sank. Her tragedy became a lesson that reshaped the modern world in maritime safety, in class consciousness, in our cultural relationship with technology and hubris. A successful maiden voyage would have been celebrated and then forgotten. The real question isn't whether the world would be better without the disaster. It's whether we would have learned those same lessons another way, or whether humanity needs its great tragedies to grow. Perhaps the Titanic's deepest legacy isn't the 1,500 lives lost, but the lessons those lives bought for everyone who came after. And that, for better or worse, is a ship that did not sink in vain.